Making It Work is brought to you by the Max Dupree Center for Leadership at Fuller Theological Seminary and the Theology of Work Project.
Welcome to Making It Work.
Through conversation, scripture, and stories, we invite God into work's biggest challenges so that you can live out your purpose in the workplace.
I'm Mark Roberts.
And I'm Leah Archibald. And this is Making It Work. In your workplace, there may be deep divides that separate you from the people you work with. How can you bridge those gaps and make a connection with someone at work, maybe someone who thinks differently from you? To talk about bringing people together at the same table, we have a very special guest today. Adrian Miller is a lawyer turned political advisor turned food author, and he's the author of several books about the significance of food in bringing people together. His latest book, The President's Kitchen Cabinet, was inspired in part by his experience working in the White House. Thank you, Adrian Miller, for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So we have a kind of a funny podcast setup today. It's not our usual setup. Usually I'm recording in my office in Boston, Massachusetts, and I have a host who's on the West Coast, and we're each, in our own little recording bubbles, very separate, but pulled together by technology. But today, we're actually in the same room recording, you and I. We're brought together at Upper House in Madison, Wisconsin. We were speaking about your work. Would you just talk a little bit about what your work is these days, bringing people together?
Yeah, because I've been thinking a lot about how our society is so divided, and I was looking for creative ways to bring us together. I keep saying we need reconciliation entrepreneurs, people that are very creative, that kind of get away from the old ways of bringing people together and try to figure out new spaces. And I just think food is a compelling way to do that because we all have to eat. Most of us enjoy eating. And cooking is an act of love. I tell people that when somebody prepares food for you, they're saying they care about your survival. In a way, they're saying they love you. Even if the food is really nasty, at least the act of doing that is an act of love.
And then you don't tell them you have
right.
It's an act of love to eat it, even if it's nasty.
Right. And I think if you think about when you eat with someone, you have to recognize their humanity because you're at a common table. You're looking at each other. You're talking, not with your mouth full, but you're talking. And I think it's just easier to make connections and to break down those walls that may keep you from interacting.
You were in the Clinton White House working for the Initiative for One America. How is it? Is it challenging bringing people together across political lines? Or?
Yeah. So I was doing this work in the 90s, and that was a very challenging time. There was a lot of division then as well. But in a way, I think elected officials have more kind of freedom and latitude to do this work because it's kind of unexpected. I think people kind of expect people of faith to kind of do this work because of it's part of their faith mission and things like that. But when a politician does it, it just seems unexpected. I mean, a lot of politicians talk about bringing us together, but how many times do they actually put a lot of energy into some kind of long-term or sustained initiative to bring us together? Yeah, you don't see that very often. So it's surprising, and I think because a politician is representing several different interests and trying to mediate those interests, I think it gives them a lot of freedom to bring people together. And plus, people want to hang out with a popular politician too. So they'll be willing to come into that space because they see a long-term benefit to that.
Let's talk about Christians who are in the workplace, who are maybe not in a faith-based setting, in a secular setting. Mm-hmm. How can Christians in the workplace take the work that you've been doing on convening people across different lines? What would be some ideas of speaking across those gaps in the workplace?
Yeah, so I think part of the challenge is just talking in a different language. So when you're interacting with people in that secular space, I'll give you one example. I worked at a think tank, and so I'm driven by Matthew 25, helping the least of these. And so, but in the public policy arena, we talk about helping those in society's margins, those who are left behind. So it's just a different language, but it's the same, perspective. And you're trying to bend policy to match with your faith beliefs in a way that secular people will be, oh, no, I'm down for that, because I want to help people at the margins. So I think part of it is learning the language and then using the force of your personality and trying to be persuasive to bring people along. And that's not always easy, but I think we have a divine mission in this stuff. So I think with all things, God's possible. With all things, God will make it possible. So there are some challenges, but I've had a lot of fulfilling work doing that. One example is when I worked for Colorado's governor, I was the head of something called the Campaign to End Childhood Hunger. And so during my time there, we came very close to serving 1 million meals to hungry kids. And so, that was an instance where I was able to match up kind of my faith with the works in the public sphere.
With the food angle, which is obviously something that's very compelling to you.
Yeah, so it all kind of came together. Yeah.
So I love this piece of advice of de-Christianizing our language, or taking the edge off our language is a way that we can talk to people across barriers.
Right, because you'll find that a lot of people in the secular spaces actually agree with kind of the end goals. So it's just a way that, describing the common mission, the common purpose, I guess we would say, and then, creating a compelling vision for getting to that place where a lot of people want to get to. It's just so many people are turned off by faith talk and religion that you might lose some people unnecessarily, even though they really agree with you where you're trying to go.
So have you always had the focus on food? Where did food come into your career trajectory?
Yeah, so the short answer is unemployment. So I was working for a president.
Which is a good convincer of all of us.
Yeah. Well, I'd always liked to cook. And I started cooking as a child because my mother worked the night shift. And so I had a twin sister and a brother. And so we would have to cook breakfast for each other. So I was making gourmet delights like scrambled eggs with eggshells, mapo, malto meal.
It was an act of love, and they had to act as if they loved it.
Right. Now, they didn't really seem like they felt like I was loving them by what I served them, but, I was good at pancakes and French toast. So I'd always had this interest in cooking, was working in the Clinton administration, and I was at the very end of his second term. So at that point in my life, I wanted to be the senator from Colorado. That was my professional goal. So I was trying to get back to Colorado to start my political career, but the job market was really slow. And sadly, I was watching a lot of daytime television. I'm not even going to tell you what shows. So in the depth of my depravity, I just said, I should read something. So I went to a bookstore, I'm looking in the cookbook section, and I see this book on the history of Southern food by a guy named John Edgerton. And in that book, he wrote that the tribute to African-American achievement in cookery has yet to be written. The book was 10 years old. I thought that was really interesting. So I emailed him out of the blue, and I said, hey, has somebody written this book? And he said, you know what? Nobody's really done it. So with no qualifications at all, except for eating a lot of soul food and cooking it some, God spoke to me and said, yeah, you could do that. So that's really what started the journey.
And have you felt like your work has achieved what you set out to achieve, that it's really a tribute to African-American contribution?
I absolutely believe that my work has been a tribute to African-American cooks, but I think it's also taken on some other dimensions. One, it's really kind of demystified kind of the bad myths about soul food. The idea that it's just the master's leftovers, it's the food that white people don't want to eat, that it's not worthy of celebration, that it needs a warning label, it's going to kill you if you eat it on a regular basis. Through my work, I've been able to say, well, it's a little more complicated than that. Soul food is a very complex cuisine that marries ingredients and culinary techniques from West Africa, Western Europe, and the Americas. And so as I see people's faces change while I'm giving the presentation, saying, oh, wow, even black people, because, black people are like, I know everything about soul food. There's nothing you can tell me. And they're like, wow, I didn't know that by the end of the presentation. So I think the work has been very beneficial. And then also just telling the stories of these African-American cooks who have been foundational to American cuisine.
There's this really interesting passage at the end of the Bible in the book of Revelation where it talks about, what the culmination of God's vision of a city is going to look like the New Jerusalem. It's in Revelation 21:26, and it says all the nations are going to bring their gifts, to the throne. All people are going to worship together. And it doesn't say everyone is going to, come into the city and prepare the exact same food. It's everyone's coming from all the different nations to bring what is unique to that nation together in the city to worship God. This is running through my mind as I'm talking to you as a vision of something that we could achieve one day.
I just think you've described the ultimate church potluck. That's what I thought you just described. So I'll have to take a look at that scripture again.
Yeah, so tell me more Tell me more about your ideal vision of a church potluck. A church potluck is like a microcosm of this vision of Revelation. So how would you like to see people convene?
Yeah, so the first part is people bringing something that is meaningful to them, something that tells a story about who they are, where they've come from, that they're willing to share. I would love to have that aspect of it. So, really good food that a lot of people can eat. So the potluck that we did, there was gluten-free options, there was vegan soul food. And I like seeing the church mothers and, bringing their dishes, showing off, little competition going on. But a nice spread. But then to me, the beautiful part is when you're sitting down at the table and you see fellowship. You see people that normally would not intersect in the regular daily course of their lives, sitting down there talking, laughing, sharing. To me, that's the ultimate. And then when we had that potluck, we had a worship service. So we had just a very small thing, but just to see people singing together from all these different traditions, it's just beautiful.
Do you see a way for folks outside of church communities, people in the workplace, to use food as a convening tool?
I definitely see that. In fact, we're already seeing that right now. There's a lot of activism in terms of food, and the broad rubric is called food justice. So you have a lot of people in our society looking at how do we get people who are poor, chronically poor, on the margins, how can we get them access to healthy food? Because a common term that's put out there is food deserts, but I like the term food swamps. It's not like there's no food there. It's just there's a lot of bad food, and so you've got places like in Denver. They're called food rescues. So what they will do is they will work with the shelter, but then you have a team of either volunteers or workers who bike food to people who are sick and shut in or whatever. So, they're working to get food to places. You have a lot more farmers markets popping up. You have not more clergy now thinking about food as a ministry. They're looking out in the congregation and looking at the health ailments, and they're figuring out, well, how can food change this equation? Believe it or not, there's a pastor in northern Mississippi, African-American pastor, who banned fried chicken at church functions.
Really?
Yeah, this pastor still has a job. This pastor is still alive.
I imagine there'd be a little bit of pushback.
There was a little bit of pushback, but you know what? He had a vision, and So you're starting to see a lot of activity within the church, and I see that spilling over in the workplace as well. Food drives, but there's a lot of energy around. Okay, how do we change our current food system, which people of faith and people in secular areas are saying it's not really working for everyone. And so, to more directly answer your question, when I was in government, I find most energy in food policy. You're finding a lot of people now paying attention to, well, what has led us to this place? And a lot of times it's just policies have created poor incentives or have led to certain developments. And not all of this was intended. I don't think people thought it would play out this way 30, 40 years ago. But now we see the consequences of kind of our current food system. And so
can you give us an example of where food policy is?
For example, we have created policies that have led to more agribusiness and has led to basically the disappearance of a lot of small farms. And so for the sake of efficiency and also just to meet the growing demands for meat consumption and other things, this has led us to these large agribusinesses that have now animals in a confined space, eating, the push for antibiotics, those kind of things have happened. And it makes sense that people were trying to meet the need for the growing demand for meat. But as a consequence of that, now we are seeing that it has implications. We're seeing more diseases. We are seeing now that the antibiotics in animals are actually creating a lower resistance in humans. We're starting to see the antibiotics and growth hormones added to animals now affecting people eating that meat. And so now that we see those things, people are trying to, okay, well, how can we get back to a more natural way, I guess, of doing things? So that's why you see the growth of kind of free-range animals. You're starting to see the marketplace have antibiotic-free, growth hormone-free, because consumers are now wanting that. So that's just one example. And another example is when we think of farmers markets. Now a number of farmers markets will accept food stamps or benefits designed for the poor, so they can actually get fresh food instead of being, relegated to very few choices. So those kind of things are happening, and it's driven by people of faith and people in the secular arenas as well. So I think it's exciting stuff that's happening right now, because we've got some serious challenges. We still have population growth. We're dealing with a lot of environmental issues, so we have to figure out how to work all of these things out. And it's gonna take some work. It's gonna take creativity, but I think we can get there.
So tell us about your favorite dish, or something that you would like to, if you're going to bring together people to your table and you want to have them have hard conversations
Yes.
about deep issues. What are you going to serve to them?
All right. So my favorite dish is greens. And so in soul food, the favorite greens are collard, kale, mustard, turnip, and cabbage. So I tell people, if you've been introduced to kale in the last 5 to 10 years, welcome to the party. African Americans have been eating it for about 300. And I love black-eyed peas, and I love cornbread. Those three things I could eat multiple times a week. And the thing I like about those dishes is that you can make vegetarian versions as well as the traditional flavored with ham hock or smoked turkey. You're seeing that a lot more. So that's something that all kinds of people could come to eat those things. Because my ultimate favorite food is barbecue, but that leaves out a lot of people, especially once you start getting to specific regions of barbecue styles. Everybody has.
So there's competitiveness between the regions.
Yeah. Absolutely. I often talk about barbecue as having denominations based on region, and they definitely have followers.
Does that make you a bishop? Are you a bishop of barbecue?
Oh, you know what? I got to trademark that.
That's a new tagline for you. The Adrian Miller, the bishop of barbecue. So I interrupted you though, because I was so interested in the barbecue. And you were telling about, what an ideal meal that you would serve to people.
Yeah.
If you want to get them to bridge divides and talk about difficult issues. So how would you do that over a meal?
So what I would do is, first of all, have the meal, and then I would just talk to people. I was like, hey, this is what's in this dish. And so I would just ask people around the table, hey, does any of this look familiar to you? And, you might think, hey, yeah, we eat kale in my culture, but we do it in a different way. Or we don't have black-eyed peas, but we have lentils. Because there are a lot of cultures that eat lentils on an auspicious day. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Southern tradition of having black-eyed peas on New Year's Day for good luck.
No.
Oh, yeah. So on New Year's Day, a lot of Southerners or people with Southern heritage, they will have black-eyed peas for either good luck or money. That's the symbolism. And then greens for folding money. So the idea is that if you eat this stuff on the first day of the year, you'll be prosperous the rest of the year. I've been doing this for 30 years, and it hasn't really worked out that way for me every year. But, So,
but you get to enjoy them on New Year's Day,
absolutely.
which is prosperity in its own right.
Absolutely. And so just try to find the commonalities. And often what I find is that even when you just ask that question, even if people don't have something in common, they start talking about their food traditions. And then that usually riffs, and then you just have a robust conversation. Then the other thing I do, in case the conversation starts to stall, I ask who likes to cook. And whoever likes to cook, my go-to question is, okay, what's your show-off dish? I'm coming over. What are you going to make? And that leads to a lot of robust discussion. And so then once you have that kind of commonality, the conversation can go so many different directions. It could be about home. It could be about celebration in a community. It could be just like, how do people relate with their own families? It's just like so many departure points for the conversation. And then after you've built that kind of camaraderie, that rapport, then you kind of decide, okay, is that enough for this gathering? Do we leave it alone, or do we start transitioning to the more difficult stuff? My experience is that first gathering should just be relational. And then you get to because you want people to come back. And then you get to the other stuff.
And how do you do it? How do you bring up difficult conversations?
So I'm one of these dudes that's just pretty much upfront. And I'm going to say, look, we have a challenge in our community. It could be an event that had precipitated it. But what I do is identify whatever the problem is, and then I just make an appeal. And I just say, I think we're all people of goodwill, and I think that we can get through this. And I also say, if it's a faith audience, if it's Christians, I just say, we're called to this. We're called to be the light in the times of darkness. And there are very few spaces left in our society where people can come together of various backgrounds. When you think about it now, there's very few spaces left. And I said, people of faith should be demonstrating how to live together, how to hold the tension, how to disagree but still love. We should be demonstrating. That's in our wheelhouse. And unfortunately, I think a lot of times we're doing the opposite. We're demonstrating the opposite. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity for people of faith to lead in these times. And one of the things that I really think we could demonstrate is forgiveness. You've heard the term cancel culture.
I haven't heard the term cancel culture. Explain it to me.
It's possible. You must not spend your life on Twitter. So cancel
I
culture.
should.
So cancel culture is this idea that if you make a mistake, that's it for you. There's no, you just got to go away. You're banished forever. Which I understand why people feel so strongly about this, especially if something is egregious. But we're all human beings. We all make mistakes, and a society, I believe, can only effectively operate if there's a path for redemption. There has to be a way for people to come back and be part of the community. And so I think Christians, especially when we feel like we've been betrayed or offended or whatever, if we can demonstrate forgiveness, I think that's just a powerful example.
Is there a piece of scripture or something from the Bible that you particularly hang on to or you go back to that gives you inspiration in your work?
Yeah, I think about Jeremiah because I want to be a hopeful person. So I think of the plans that I have for you, not plans for your harm, but for your welfare. I think about that scripture a lot. And then this may sound silly, but all of the scriptures that deal with burnt offerings come to mind because I think about barbecue. So I know.
Interesting. Say more.
Well, so Micah, 6th chapter, right? We often go to the part that talks about walking humbly with your, that. But before that, he's talking about burnt offerings. And so I think that's a biblical imperative for barbecue. And he's just saying, hey, that's not enough. You got to do this other stuff. So
the barbecue is not enough.
It's pleasing, but it's not enough.
There's the both and.
Right.
There's the offering, the tangible food that brings people together. And there's also the walking in humbleness and pursuing the work of justice.
Exactly.
Those have to go hand in hand.
Yeah.
You're giving 2 talks today,
Yes.
and they're both served with a meal.
Yes.
So thank you for that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm glad we could pull it off.
It's an excellent benefit of being here in person. So what do you hope that people will gain either from the meal experience or from your talks today?
So many things. So first of all, with the first talk is on the theology of soul food and barbecue. So I've given you a taste already of that. But key for me is the fellowship. I want people to have a good time being in this space. But I want them to understand this concept of radical hospitality. This idea that we can be inviting, we can bring people into a space and see the divine in them and how meaningful and transformative that is. And in our lives, the Bible has a lot of food imagery, a lot of hospitality references, and I invite people to think about, are they making a welcome table in their life? Are you being inviting to people who disagree with you, who may not share your faith tradition? I think, unfortunately, in our times, Christians can often be seen as just closed-minded and uninviting. And I hope that we in our lives can just counteract that. I think there's tremendous opportunity. And then I want people just to have fun with food and see the promise and possibility of food and bringing us together. And then my evening presentation is about the African-American presidential chefs. And that's really just to show how foundational African-Americans have been to presidential food and to give through slavery and freedom and to give just really more of a perspective of their contributions. I think they were celebrated in their times, but I don't think today, when people think about White House food, I don't think they think about the legacy of African Americans, which is interesting because if you were just to line up all of the White House cooks in a room, most of them would be African American women. That would be, over time, that would be the face of White House cooking. And I don't think anybody really thinks about that. So I'm trying to bring African American history and show that it is American history, but to show just how faithful people were in all of these contexts. And then the last thing, I know I've given a long list, the last thing is just to show how the church has been important in creating those spaces, to being a vehicle for fellowship and for reconciliation. And how, even right now in our time, the church is a leader in food justice movements. So the church is not dead, the church is still relevant, Um, and it's just a matter of it's we as Christians if we give life to that. Otherwise, it will die if we don't give life to it.
Well, you've made us hungry to learn more. And if folks want to learn more, they can read one of your books. One is called Soul Food. The other is called The President's Kitchen Cabinet.
Yeah.
And we'll put links to these books on the podcast page on our website. Adrian Miller, thank you so much for joining us today.
All right.
It's been a very spicy conversation. I enjoyed it.
Mission accomplished.
I recorded my first interview with Adrian Miller in February of 2020. Because of developments in the spring and summer of 2020, I wanted to talk to him more about what it means to build bridges in your work. The following interview comes from a follow-up talk we had, August of 2020. Let's refresh our memories about what we were talking about a few months ago. Well, I'll start by saying, Adrian Miller, welcome back to the Making It Work podcast. We spoke a few months ago about your work bringing people to the table together to speak about issues and how to make that, a little more, those conversations easier. And since the last time we spoke, there have been some significant developments. In the United States, there was the killing of George Floyd among, other men and women of color, which launched widespread protests against racially biased violence. There's been a new conversation worldwide about the racism that's ingrained in our workplaces and in our institutions. Has any of this changed the way that you think about your work?
Absolutely. First of all, it's good to be with you again. And despite this tragic context, I'm glad we have an opportunity to discuss this a little bit more. So it has changed my work only in this sense, mainly in this sense, I should say. I find that there are more white people who are ready to explore the topic of racial justice and are willing to learn more. And I can't say that that's been the case before. So as these things happened and as the community and worldwide response fomented over the killings of so many African Americans, I have to tell you, I thought we would be at this place 5 years ago when that young man went into the church, the AME church in Charleston, South Carolina, Mother Emanuel, and killed the people in that Bible study group. I thought that was going to spark the kind of introspection that we're getting now, but it didn't for some reason. And I think the difference is, one, there's a lot of pent up energy because, before that happened, these events in kind of May and late May, we were cooped up because of the pandemic. So a lot of people were at home due to stay at home orders. And then the other thing is, I think it's the video. Because I have to tell you, in my experiences, when I tell white people about things that Black people go through, I think at some point it's always discounted because it's so outside their own realm of experience. They're just thinking, well, that can't really happen. Even though they know me and they believe me to some extent, I think it's just always discounted. But with that video, the length of it and the brutality of it, and just to see this defenseless man be killed, there was no way to explain it away. Because what I've experienced in my past is people say, oh, well, that person was resisting arrest or, there's always some reason to excuse it. And I think the horrible, the lack of humanity and grace and love that was extended to this man calling for his mother as he was dying, I think profoundly affected a lot of people. And I think a lot of people say, hey, something's really wrong here. And if I may give another kind of example of why I think this moment is different, is shortly after that, a friend of mine who's a young white woman with small kids, she just went on Facebook and she said, you know what, I'm really disturbed by what happened. And I just think we need to talk about this. We as white people need to talk about this. So if you're a young mother with kids, I'm going to be in this park on this day and at this time. And if you want to join me and come talk to me about this, please join me. She had 40 people show up.
Wow.
And she gave a synopsis of their discussion afterwards. And I have to tell you, I've just never seen that happen. And I am convinced that if we're going to really make a breakthrough on race, we have to have white people talking to other white people about this for the reasons I explained earlier. Because when an African American or a person of color is in a mix in these discussions, I think people tend to lean too heavily on the person of color to guide them through the discussion.
Mhm.
I think people censor themselves because nobody wants to say the wrong thing and look like they might be racist. Um, and so we really need honest discussion. And I think a lot of it is going to be white people talking to white people they respect and saying, hey, there's a problem here. And this is why this is This is why this is playing out this way.
Mm. And you have personal experience in this because in your work, you've kind of been this lightning rod for going into white spaces and talking about race. And you do it with a sense of humor, and you do it by bringing people together over the food and the barbecue. But you've met in the past with some resistance of white people wanting to talk about race, haven't you?
I have. So, I tell people somewhat jokingly that I have two gifts. One is, for some reason, I have ability to talk to white people about race. And then the second thing is I have this God-given patience that no matter what crazy thing comes out of somebody's mouth, I'm willing to just sit there and hold the tension. And I think a lot of reason why our discussions break down is when somebody says something that another person thinks is crazy, they write them off into discussion and they're out of there. And that's one thing that keeps us from having honest dialogue, because we never really get to the guts of the matter because we're just so careful of not offending one another. And that's a good impulse, right? I mean, we just don't want to hurt other people's feelings, but we're dealing with 400 years plus of some stuff. And it's not going to go away very easily. So in my own experience, there's really just kind of, I see two lingering challenges. One is the times that I have created these spaces to talk about race, it's pretty much people who already agree that there's something that needs to be done. So, so a challenge is, how do you get people who disagree with you or who just maybe haven't even really thought about race? Because one thing that's a aspect of life in this country is white people can go through life for the most part without actually having to think about their race. So how do you provoke somebody to really consider that and to really be introspective about that and get them into that space? And then the other challenge is, again, when you're in that space, how do you make it inviting enough so that people will be honest with what they're really feeling? Because a lot of the times, especially when we're talking about racism or any other ism, some of this stuff is learned behavior from people we love. We may have picked it up from parents. We may have picked it up from friends. However we reach those conclusions, sometimes it's like calling us to have a reckoning with, how we were raised, how we were socialized. I've had to do that with women. I have to think about how much I have embraced patriarchy and sexism and how I have in subtle ways displayed that in my life. Because I think I'm a good guy, in discussion with women, I'm like, oh man, I have not even really thought about that. And in those experiences with women and thinking about patriarchy and sexism actually deepened my thought about race, because it was that moment I said, okay, I think I'm a good guy and I have these issues about women. So, and I just never thought about them because of my maleness. So what does that mean for a white person who's just never had to think about race? How can I automatically think that person is bad?
Mm-hmm. Which is, it's an interesting point, because you're having kind of an awakening moment in terms of sexism, which many people would not be, and white people right now, myself included, are having an awakening moment due to racism. And as you were saying, it comes from being confronted with images, this video that's possibly something that we've never seen before. As I was preparing for our conversation, I was thinking, as a person of faith, what models do I have in scripture to contextualize this moment? I'm always thinking, like, did God's people ever go through something like this before? Is there ever hope? Is there some hope that we can get from the Bible? And, I was thinking individual change and institutional changes are things that we see in the Bible. I was thinking, how do we get individuals to have an awakening to the racism issue? And then how do we get systems to change? And you tell me if you come up with another model in your thinking. The model I thought of was Paul in the book of Acts starts off as a persecutor of the early Christians. And then he has this personal turnabout in Acts chapter 9 because he has a personal confrontation with Jesus, an encounter with Jesus, a supernatural experience where Jesus literally strikes him blind and he changes course. And from there, Paul is able to, one, do a lot of work preaching about Jesus and convert a lot of Gentiles, and then later goes back in Acts chapter 15, goes back to the Council of Jerusalem and convinces others that, hey, this system is not just for Jews, it's for Gentiles as well. The Holy Spirit is released to everybody. So that's, it's one example I was thinking in the Bible of personal change sparking some individual change, but it came from the supernatural encounter element. I don't know if you see any link between either this biblical story or a different biblical story for the moment that we're going through.
Yeah, so I think about two stories. One is one that a lot of people have heard is the Good Samaritan story. And the reason why I focus on that story is because in that teaching, Jesus was using two groups who hated each other, the Jewish people and Samaritans, for maybe the ultimate story of hospitality and kindness extended by a stranger. So I often use that as an entry point. And then another thing I think about is that in a lot of discussions that Jesus has with people in the Bible, Jesus is never the one to really end the conversation. He listens, he provokes, he asks questions, but it's always the other person who leaves. And so what I think Jesus is demonstrating to us is that we need to be engaged with people as far as they want to take it. And so what really saddens me in this case, especially with people of faith traditions, is how many times do you hear church people saying, I'm not going to even sit down at the table with that person. And that's not, to me, that's not the Christian example. Christian example is to get in there and listen and discuss and love, because we recognize the humanity in everyone. So that's been problematic in my work because so many lines have been drawn based on race. And I can't remember, I know it was a while ago when we talked about this, but I've got situations where if a pastor says Black Lives Matter from the pulpit, white people get up and leave mid-sermon. Also another anecdote from my work. So I send out a monthly email newsletter, and then periodically I will send out other emails if something comes up in between. I can just tell you, after 7 years, if I do any email that explicitly talks about racial justice, I will get unsubscribes. It's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when.
How do you personally, in your own work, sort of bounce back from those unsubscribes? Because I imagine that they feel kind of like barbs, but are there elements of your own faith that help when you encounter racism in your personal work?
Yeah, so it's just a belief that I have a role, and I'm trusting in God to lead me to where God thinks I need to be. So it's a constant process of discerning. And it helps me to just wonder, am I communicating well? What can I do to maybe re-engage those people who unsubscribe? So I take it as a challenge because I believe I'm on the right side of justice in this work. And so I think it's just a deep understanding of what we of good faith, we of good intentions face as challenges. Because look, I'm not going to say, I never thought it was going to be easy. Okay. Let me just say that. I just didn't think it was going to be this hard.
Your books about food are not just neutral books about food. They are very subtly bringing both Black people and white people into a conversation about how racism is systematized in our culture.
Yeah. And so some people have really, and I think that's another thing that people really like about me. They said that, you figured out a way to talk about race that's inviting. And it's a way for me to plug into a conversation. So one thing I've been talking about lately is this idea of the welcome table. Sometimes I do the story about the great wedding banquet. and other things. But the main point is, okay, God is calling us to set a welcome table for others. So how are we setting welcome tables in our lives? Are we just inviting the people we like, or are we really doing a y'all come? And I really think that food is a powerful tool for reconciliation. I'm right now working on a guidebook, basically like how do you have a dialogue, not on just on race, but any tough discussion, and use food as the way to gain momentum in that discussion. So, like for instance, almost every culture has some kind of dumpling, right? So what if you just had a potluck and you just said, "Hey, bring a dumpling from your food tradition." Somebody show up with chicken and dumplings. Somebody could show up with something else. Somebody could show up with pork bow. And then you sit down there and and then eventually you start to see the commonalities that we have.
So Jesus in Matthew 22 talks about heaven as this feast of the unlikely invitees, as if, the kingdom where God lives, whether that's in this life or the next, is a place where unlikely people come sit down at the table together. And I think you've pictured this really focused on, what is on the table, like the unlikely food combinations that might draw us together and start the conversation. Like, what are we talking about when we're sitting around at the table together? We must be talking about what's different about us, but what's also similar about us.
Right.
And we're in this very weird moment where we, many people cannot physically go meet together over food because we're, distanced in a global pandemic, which, as you said, has brought a lot of other issues to the fore. But it's also really difficult to meet with people face to face. So how do you think this changes conversations about race or conversations that we might have with others in our workplaces?
Yeah, I think that's the real challenge now. I am actually trying to think that through, because if I'm going to put out a guide, that's definitely an element. Is like, how do you do this going forward in a virtual way? So one thing, I think technology can help us in this sense. You could still have a large gathering, but now, at least with some platforms, you can break into smaller groups. So I think the concept still holds, and you just say, hey, if your platform allows you to break into smaller groups, you should do this. So that's what I'm thinking right now. I think technology may help us with that in a way, even though we're separated right now. I think there's still meaningful ways for us to connect. One thing I do wonder is it easier for somebody who's on the fence about engaging in a discussion to be involved in a virtual discussion? Could that be a situation where the separation actually reduces anxiety?
So tell us a little bit about this guidebook. Can you give us a little taste of your program, so to speak? Like, let's say I want to start a dialogue among my coworkers, right? Where I have, I work where there are people of different races and different backgrounds, and with what's going on in the world, I feel uncomfortable. Other people feel uncomfortable coming together and trying to have these conversations, but also trying to maintain a cordial work atmosphere. A lot of us feel uncomfortable with what's going on in the news, and how do we process it inside our office? So how would you suggest we go through some of your steps to, open up some of these conversations?
So I think the first thing would just be just a typical potluck. So no restrictions. Just say, bring some food from your favorite food or whatever. And then I think, let's just say it's a race dialogue. I think the first meeting is, for most of it, is socializing. And then I think for the second half of that meeting, it would be setting some context for people of color or whatever to say, okay, here's the challenge we have in this time. I'm glad you stepped into this moment. This is what we'd like to do. And if you'd like to be a part of it, this is what it looks like. And then people can decide if they want to be in it or not. I think that most people going into that meeting will have a heads up, right? They'll know, but you never know. And then I think the second meeting is whatever the group of people of color who have decided to be engaged is just to describe the problem in more depth. So that would be the call. And then I think the really crucial thing is for that next meeting to be the response from people outside their community. So we call this allyship in some contexts or others, but then it would be like, okay, we heard what you said, and here's how I'm responding to it. And there's going to be interracial dialogue in all of these things, but I'm just talking about the main thrust of the meeting. And then that fourth meeting, I think, is to talk about, okay, we've had a call and a response. I think we've discerned the problem. This fourth meeting is about what do we think we can do in our community or in our context to actually have meaningful change. Now, that could end the whole discussion with just a set of recommendations, but my hope is that people will glob on to at least one or two of those recommendations and continue the work. Because what I find is, first of all, is there's fatigue from people of color in having to lead these discussions, only because I think they feel like they never go anywhere, like nothing meaningful ever comes from them. From people outside the community, mainly white people, I find there's a fear of talking about these things. And for those who have overcome their fear, there's really there's no sense of how to have the discussion. So I feel like they often have to have people of color kind of help them get through that discussion. But then, but the critical part is actually starting to work on meaningful solutions, because people don't want to talk forever.
They want to do something.
They want to do something.
At some point, they want to clear the table and get to doing some actual work together.
Yeah, and the doing something may be it could be a mix of things, right? It could be some things that are, like, let's just say in a church context, maybe the doing something is to have a regular interracial Bible study. Or, there could be recommendations like, no, we need political action. We need to get our city council to do what Asheville, North Carolina just did, which is to pass a formal resolution for reparations. So it's going to take different forms in different communities.
Or in a workplace context, it might look like, let's have a formal procedure for looking at what the makeup of our corporate board looks like and who is represented on the board. Or let's look at our mentorship programs and see, who is represented in the promotional schedule and how those recommendations are made.
Yes. So there's so many levels. Yeah.
It really does relate to the picture you mentioned earlier in Jesus' parable of this great banquet in Matthew 22, where everyone is invited, but not everybody shows up.
Right.
And that your plan for inviting people into these tough conversations is to send out a lot of invitations.
Yeah.
First you invite them to the step one potluck, where we're socializing and we're having a conversation. And then you invite them into a deeper conversation. Would you like to be involved in talking to this more? And at the end of this process, you invite them into, is there some action? Can we do a collective action together, either making some changes, in the institution that we're a part of together or in the wider society? But each step of the way is invitational.
Right.
Which is what Jesus also extended to the people around him, or through his parable.
Mm-hmm. And, one of the funny things about that parable is like, there were so many ridiculous reasons why people wouldn't go, which shows Jesus using humor. And sometimes I don't think Jesus gets enough credit for the humor that he provided in some of his teachings. But
today he'd be like, I got to check my Twitter feed. I got to wash my cat. Like, I just can't come today.
Right. Well, this is a lesson for everybody. Jesus started out with 12 followers, right? So there's no reason for you to say, I don't have enough people on my social media. Jesus started with 12. But yeah, so we have to understand that when we extend the invitation, not everybody's going to say yes. But I think that also means we don't write somebody off when they say no. I think it's just a matter of circling back periodically and just making people know that they're always welcome. I think there's, because, we call it cancel culture today, but there's so much writing off. And, just as a side note, I think there's a tremendous opportunity for people of faith to just kind of talk about forgiveness in this time, because we are in a very unforgiving time. And part of it is the reckoning part, right? There's deep-seated grievance. And, prior to this moment, people of color, marginalized people have asked for justice and they were denied. So they got a right to be mad. But
Mm-hmm.
if we want a shared future, at some point we have to forgive people, and there has to be redemption. There has to be a way for somebody who messed up to come back. Because if there's no way to come back, I don't see how we ever get these problems solved. Because we're all human, we're all going to make mistakes. I've already made 3 during this interview. So, you've been gracious to me. So you didn't end the interview. You just said, I'm going to hang in there with this dude, even though
I made 20 mistakes today before breakfast. I got to tell you, we all I need that grace. I actually feel very hopeful listening to you say this. You're a Black man and I'm a white woman. And during this period of increased awareness about the ways that I'm not even aware of my own privilege, it's felt very uncomfortable, for me. And there have been times that my first instinct has been I don't want to engage in that conversation, or I don't want to engage in that conversation right now. I'll put it off. I'll put it off a little while until I'm feeling a little bit more open to that. And which is my privilege, that I get to shut down a conversation, for a particular period of time. I understand that. So I feel a lot of grace from you saying it's a rolling invitation. The way Jesus would set up this banquet is to have the invitation consistently open. He doesn't just throw one potluck. He throws potluck after he's been doing it for a couple years now. We still keep making mistakes, even though the gospel's already been given for some reason. Us humans keep making mistakes, and this grace continues to be available.
Yeah, I just think there's tremendous opportunity. And I am hopeful because, like I said, I just think white people are now more in tune than I've ever seen. In fact, I'll just tell you a really quick story. So I was on Twitter, this guy posted a video, African-American guy. He was stopped. He had temporary tags on his car. And so he was stopped, and the cops were asking him questions, and they were checking. And he said he looked over and he noticed this white woman was recording the entire interaction. And at first he didn't know what she was doing. And he said this whole thing took 15 minutes. Like, the cops took their sweet time checking it. And he said that white woman had her camera rolling the entire 15 minutes and gave him a look that signaled to him that she was worried something was going to happen to him. And so she wanted to make sure that there was evidence of it. And he's like, okay, well, okay, ally. Wow. He's kind of funny about it. But, that's that stuff that has not happened before. So the question for us in this moment is, typically the energy for these things dissipate after a few months. Is that going to be the case? Or can we bring alive Gianna Floyd's words? That's the 6-year-old daughter of George Floyd. She said, "My daddy changed the world." Can we make those words really come true? And the only way we can do that is we have good intention, goodwill. We have to keep at it. Even though we're tired, we got to keep at it. Because we were dealing with some very powerful forces.
Yeah. Amen. And we can't fix them in one moment. It's got to be one meal at a time, one bite at a time, one conversation at a time.
That could preach.
God bless. Well, Adrian Miller, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation again. And God bless you in this continuing work.
Thank you again for the opportunity to be with you virtually.
Oh, it's been great. Thank you.
That's our show. Don't miss the next episode. Be sure to subscribe.
And if you like what you've heard, please leave a review. We'd love to hear from you, and it helps other people find us. Thanks for listening.